Hey, good morning, everybody. Right now, we are going to handle the media effects chapter. And what this is a huge information dump of all of the different theories about media and their effects on us. Are you ready? I know this is exciting. So here's the hard part. If you're going to say, yeah, the media affect people, there's two huge questions. How are you going to determine what the effects are? And how do you measure them? Like, it's one thing to say, I'm going to measure the violence in media. Okay, well, how are you defining violence? And how are you going to define what those effects are that you're looking for? So, media effects analysis can be really, really, really hard to do because there's so many variables, right? I mean, there's other things that have impacts on us besides the media, but well, we'll tackle all of it. Okay, here we go. So the beginning of media research actually began with a study called the pain study. And what they did is that they put kids in a movie theater and wired them with electrodes and then showed a bunch of violent stuff. And apparently it was huge news that the kids' pulse quickened, their blood pressure went up, their breathing started being more rapid, and people thought this was a big news flash. Well, come on, this is a no-brainer, right? The way you remember the pain studies is that they wired kids up and caused kids pain, okay? Now, there's another theory, these are all theories, that transmission versus ritual perspective. Now, if you've taken an economics class, you know the difference between micro and macro, and that's exactly what transmission and ritual is. Transmission is, it's a lot like what we talked about in advertising. Transmission is the actual message. Ritual is the perpetuation of shared beliefs, the more of the macro. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So for here's a clip from a school shooting. Now, the transmission here is that the teachers are escorting the kids out of the building. But the ritual could be said to be schools are a very violent place, or America's a violent place, or guns are bad. Okay, you follow? So the transmission here is by this ring. But the ritual perspective implies that things will happen once there's a ring involved that wouldn't happen otherwise. You see the difference? It's a lot like what we talked about with advertising. Is there's like a latent message and a manifest message. And that's what the ritual and transmission and ritual theories talk about. And I'm really not doing a good job this morning. Sorry. This is one of my favorites. This is the reality validation theory. It's the idea that we watch reality or trash TV to make ourselves feel better. This is totally what I do. If I'm flipping through and I see that Hoarders is on TV, I totally watch Hoarders. I mean, not the whole time, but for a little bit, because it makes me feel great about my housekeeping abilities. Right. And I've had students in the past tell me that they watch some of these really raunchy shows to make themselves feel better about themselves. I mean, I think that it's a very human thing, and I get it. I get it. That's the reality validation theory. One of the very first theories was called the hypodermic needle model, and what it proposed was that the media affects every single person the exact same way, kind of like injecting a needle into somebody. I don't buy that. Well, just because we all respond to media messages in different ways, and so therefore we all have different effects, right? And according to your book, one of the instances that proved this theory incorrect was the War of the Worlds broadcast, that some people knew that it was a radio drama and other people thought the Martians were really invading. Okay, so media messages do not have the exact same effect on all of us. But that's the hypodermic needle model. The minimal effects model is something that we've already kind of talked about. It refers to selective exposure and selective retention. Selective exposure means that we only expose ourselves to messages with which we are familiar. And selective retention means we only remember messages that we already believe. And I think that's true. My very conservative sister-in-law only watches Fox. My very liberal sister-in-law only watches MSNBC. So they only select to expose themselves to messages that they are already familiar with. And most likely, they're going to engage in selective retention. They will only retain messages that confirm what they already believe. And I use selective retention all the time when I am debating or arguing with my husband. Uses and gratifications model is pretty interesting. What it does is it says that people use the media to satisfy certain emotional and intellectual needs. And I think that's totally true. I think that's totally true. One of the limitations, though, with the uses and gratifications model is that it answers why we use the media, but it doesn't talk about what the effects are. So I'm using Mr. Darcy here, for example, because we could watch Pride and Prejudice 800 times, not that I have or anything. And that would satisfy a certain emotional need. But what are the effects of that? Well, the effect of that is that I might think there's someone as perfect as Mr. Darcy, and there's not, right? So uses and gratifications, I think, is pretty on target, but it also doesn't talk about what the effects are. Okay. Two-step flow theory is a theory that actually sounds kind of like a country song. What it implies, though, is that the media don't influence each of us as individuals. It influences opinion leaders or influencers, okay? And then they, in turn, influence us. So there's two steps in between us and the media as far as effects go. And I don't know about this one. I mean, we'll talk about it in class, but this kind of reminds me of high school, you know, where there's the queen bees of certain cliques, and then everyone in that group follows them. Or, you know, the popular kids, maybe they're the ones. So this theory would imply that they're the ones that are affected by the media, and then everyone else is affected by them. I don't know. Oh, theory of the mediated other. This is a good one. This is the idea that if we don't know people personally, we believe what the media tells us about them. And I think that that's, I mean, I see this in play pretty often, actually. So think of it this way. If you do a Google search for angry Muslim male, you get like 15 million hits right away. Okay, so if I don't know any Muslim men personally, what does the media tell me about them? Right? If I don't know any homosexual men personally, what does the media tell me about them? If I don't know any Second Amendment proponents personally, what does the media tell me about them? If I don't know any Catholic priests personally, what does the media tell me about them? So I think, you know, we could talk about how selective exposure, selective retention, and the theory of the mediated other all work to polarize us, right? Yeah. Oh, that's a good thought. Okay. Dissonance theory. When we are confronted with information that makes us uncomfortable, we sometimes shut it down. And that's totally true. I'm a conflict avoider. So one time a couple of years ago when I was still on Facebook, two of my friends who did not know each other got into this heated debate on my page. And it gave me this knot in my stomach. So you know what I did? I just deleted the whole thing because it caused me mental discomfort. And so I did not want to go there and look at it because it was causing me mental discomfort. If you are struggling in class, you might not want to get on Canvas to see what your grade is because it causes you mental discomfort, right? So dissonance theory, I think, plays a role in the media that we choose to consume and the media that we choose not to consume. Oh, symbolic interaction. This is a fun one. This is the idea that we give certain things meaning, and that meaning controls our behavior. So let me show you what I mean. If I ask you, what is this? You would say, oh, that's the American flag. And I would say, okay, no, the American flag is the meaning we have given this. At the very basic level, this is white fabric, red fabric, and blue fabric sewn together in a particular way, right? And does this affect our behavior? Sure it does. Yeah, when it comes into a room, we're supposed to stand up. It's never supposed to fly at night unless it's illuminated. It's not supposed to touch the ground. It has very special meaning when it's draped over a casket. So and this is a lot like the association principle in advertising. We attach meaning to certain things that are very important to us. Do surveys work? I'm going to say no. You only have to look at the 2016 presidential election for that answer. People lied in polls, and Trump won, and no one expected him to win. There's pros and cons. You can get, like, voice on the street or whatever. But 2 days ago, I got a call from a survey company wanting to ask me about current events and public issues because the election's coming in. And my first question was, how long is this going to take? And she said, about 25 minutes. I said, nope. No. So think of it this way. She's calling people. What are the odds that somebody's going to answer? What are the odds that someone is going to give up 25 minutes of their day 2 weeks before the semester starts? What are the odds that that person is even going to be honest? There's a lot of variables with surveys. So there's pseudo polls that are like call-in polls for a radio station, where you're only actually hearing from people that are already listening to your station. Online polls don't count either, because you're only hearing from people who are already on your website. And plus, don't you have to feel really strongly about an issue before you respond to one of these things? So you're not getting the whole picture. I'm going to say I don't really think polls are very reliable. But I think content analysis is. And here's what content analysis is. It's actually measuring things in a media message. But there's a challenge, okay? So, for example, I once had a student do a content analysis of an episode of Big Bang Theory, and there were 46 interruptions by the laugh track. So that is easy to count, right? I'm going to do a content analysis of Big Bang Theory, and I'm going to count the laugh tracks. Easy. It would be completely different if I said, I'm going to do a content analysis of Breaking Bad, and I'm going to count the violent acts. Why is that harder? Because violent acts is very difficult to define. How are you going to say, I'm going to study an episode of Sex and the City and count the sexual activity? How are you defining it? So the challenge with content analysis isn't the counting, it's the defining of what you're going to count and how. Because, there's sexual activity is a wide spectrum, and so is violent acts. You've got verbal violence, emotional violence, and how are you going to define it? So content analysis helps you come up with some interesting data about a program or a message. But you have to be very careful about how you define it. And also, there was this one study that said that 15,000 sexual instances of sexual activity in a primetime TV show. Okay, what show? Does it matter? Yeah, it matters. It also matters what channel you're on, if it's cable or broadcast. There's all these variables. So that's what makes content analysis kind of challenging. Yeah, so here's a study that showed more than 1,300 TV shows, 56% had sexual content. All right. You should have immediately about 10 questions to ask about this. What TV shows? What time of day were they aired? Were they broadcast or cable? How are you defining sexual content? What time of the day were they? Were you watching Dora? Or were you watching something, there's so many variables. This gets me really wound up. Social learning theory. If you've taken a psychology class, you have heard about this, and we'll talk about this in class, but Bandura put two different groups of kids in a room, showed each group of kids a video of somebody beating up a Bobo doll, which is like this inflatable thing with sand on the bottom, so you hit it and it comes back up. He showed one group the video of the kids hitting the Bobo doll, another group like some nature video or something. Then he put Bobo dolls in each room, and guess what happened? The kids beat up the Bobo doll. And the kids who had watched the video of the Bobo doll, sorry. Okay, I'm really sorry about that. I forgot to mute my phone. I imagine that you all are awake now. Okay, so what happened is that the kids who had seen the video of the Bobo doll getting beaten up beat up the Bobo doll in their room more than the kids who hadn't seen the video. So Bandura came up with this theory, social learning theory, that we imitate what we see in the media. Again, How is this news? Of course we imitate what we see. My kids would use like wrapping paper tubes as lightsabers practically before they could walk. Okay. So, couple things that I want you, little red flags that I think should go off. What was the gender makeup of boys versus girls in these rooms? What was the background of the boys and girls in these rooms? Are there other variables that could lead to a kid beating up a Bobo doll other than watching a video of somebody else doing it? Also, a Bobo doll, by its creation, is made to be hit and then bounce back. So there's issues with this, but social learning theory is a big deal. And I'm going to show you a clip in class that we absolutely do imitate what we see in the mass media. Of course we do. Of course we do. Your book mentions agenda setting, saying that sometimes the media set up narratives, that they pay attention to certain issues and ignore others. I'm probably going to rant about this a little bit because I tend to think that stories that take place on the East Coast control the news cycle, and stories that take place in the Midwest really don't get a lot of attention. And I'll share some examples. I kind of have a chip on my shoulder about that. This is a big one. Cultivation theory is the idea that people who consume a lot of television tend to view the world as it is presented on TV. And I think that's true to an extent. And yet, there's also this phrase called the willing suspension of disbelief. And many times when we're consuming media, we are very willing to accept that what we're seeing is not real. I know Middle Earth doesn't exist. I know Alderaan doesn't exist. But I go there mentally, right? Because that's a part of the experience. So that's cultivation theory. And this is spiral of silence. And now we're at the end. Spiral of silence is something that you may have experienced in a class before. The idea that how you feel about a certain issue is the minority. And so you don't want to say what you think because you think you're the only one in the room that thinks that way. And I think that this is true in meetings. I think that this is true in classrooms. I think that sometimes it's even true in our families. And the reason that your book brings this up in a media book is that they claim that this idea that no one else feels the way you do is created by the media. And so we'll talk about this in class. I hope that the spiral of silence is nothing that you ever feel in one of our class discussions. That's for sure. But we are doing something super top secret and cool in class this week. So